The day I told him how I felt, I lost almost everything I had ever known: my community, my reputation, the trust of people who had loved me since the moment I was born. And for a long time, I genuinely believed that speaking those words was the worst mistake of my life. I replayed that conversation 1,000 times, wishing I could take it back, wishing I had stayed quiet, wishing I had been stronger. But here is what I eventually came to understand, and it took me years to get there. Silence was never going to save me. It was only ever going to bury me alive. I grew up plain, Amish, born into a community in Lancaster County where the rhythm of life was steady and intentional and built around something much larger than any single person's feelings. We rose early, we worked hard, we prayed often. The rules were not presented to us as restrictions, they were presented as protection, as love, as the very shape of a faithful life. And I believed that. I truly did. I was not someone who spent her childhood dreaming about leaving or questioning everything around her. I was someone who found real comfort in the structure, in the sameness of each day, in knowing exactly who I was and where I belonged. My mother taught me that a woman's strength lives in her restraint. My father taught me that honesty and humility were never in conflict. My community taught me that the individual bends toward the whole, not away from it, and I carried all of that with me every single morning when I woke up, fed the animals, helped with breakfast, and started another day that looked nearly identical to the one before it. From the outside, my life was settled, predictable, safe. But inside me, there was something quiet and restless that I could never quite name. I was 22 when I first met Daniel. He had come to the area through a sustainable farming program, partnering with several Amish families to learn traditional agricultural methods. My father was one of the families who agreed to participate. So Daniel began showing up on our property 2 or 3 mornings a week, learning how we worked the land, asking careful and respectful questions, never overstepping, never pretending to understand something he did not. He was not loud the way so many Englishmen seemed to be. He was quiet in a way that surprised me, observant, genuinely curious without being invasive. The first real conversation we had was about soil. That sounds like nothing, but it turned into a conversation about patience, about how the best things require time and attention and cannot be rushed. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I realized he was not just talking about farming anymore. And neither was I. Weeks passed, then months. Daniel kept coming and we kept talking, and I kept telling myself it was nothing, just friendship, just two people from different worlds finding common ground. I told myself that the way I felt when I heard his truck pulling up the lane was just familiarity, that the way I listened for his voice in the mornings was just routine, that the fact that I had started thinking about things differently, seeing things in my own life with new questions attached to them, was simply what happened when you spent time around someone from the outside world. But then one evening, he stayed late helping my father repair a fence, and afterward we sat on the porch steps while the sun went down, and he asked me what I was most afraid of. Not in a prying way, just genuinely, quietly, like he had all the time in the world and nowhere more important to be. And I told him the truth without even planning to. I said I was afraid of wanting something I was not allowed to want. He did not push me to say more. He just nodded slowly and said he understood that feeling better than I might think. And something shifted in me that evening that I could not shift back. I started praying harder. I started throwing myself into every task with more focus, more urgency, hoping the busyness would crowd out everything I was feeling. I avoided the porch when I knew he was nearby. I kept my answers shorter. I convinced myself that distance was the same thing as healing, but here is the truth about feelings you have tried to starve: they do not die, they just get louder. Then one morning, I heard through a neighbor that Daniel's program was ending, that he had been offered a position overseas, an agricultural consulting role, and he was likely going to take it. He had not told me yet. Maybe he did not know how. Maybe he thought it would be easier this way. But the moment I heard it, something inside me cracked completely open, and I understood with absolute certainty that if I said nothing, I would spend the rest of my life wondering. And I had watched women in my community spend their lives swallowing things that deserved to be spoken. I did not want that for myself. Not this time. I found him at the edge of the property on a Tuesday afternoon. He was alone, checking the irrigation lines, and when he saw me walking toward him, he stood up straight and waited, and I think some part of him already knew. I remember the way the light looked. I remember my hands shaking. I remember taking one full breath and then just saying it plainly, the way my father always said the truest things should be said without decoration, without apology, without pretending the words meant less than they did. I told him that I had feelings for him that went far beyond friendship, that I was not asking him to solve that or to change anything about his life, that I just needed him to know before he left, because carrying the silence any longer felt dishonest, and dishonesty was something I could not make peace with. He was quiet for a long time, and then he told me he felt the same way. He had for months. But he had also known, he said, that acting on it would put me in an impossible position, and he loved me too much, and yes, he used that word to be the reason my life fell apart. He said he had been staying because he could not make himself leave, and he had been preparing to leave because he knew staying was not fair to me. And hearing all of that was somehow both the most beautiful and the most devastating thing I had ever experienced at the same time. Because what came next was not a love story. What came next was consequence. Someone had seen us. Someone had watched that conversation from a distance and had drawn their own conclusions about what it meant and how long it had been building. By the next morning, my mother knew. By the evening, my father had spoken to the bishop. And within a week, I was sitting in the most painful conversation of my life, being asked directly whether I had developed an emotional attachment to the Englishman who had been working on our property. I told the truth, because what else could I do? I had never been able to lie, and I was not going to start at the moment it would have mattered most. The response from my community was not cruel. That is important for me to say. These were not villains. These were people who genuinely believed they were protecting me, but protection and pain can look identical from the inside. I was asked to step back from certain responsibilities. I felt the distance in people's eyes. I watched my mother cry in a way she had not cried since we lost my grandfather, and knowing I had caused that was something I am not sure I will ever fully forgive myself for. And Daniel left. He took the position overseas. We said goodbye at the edge of the lane one early morning, and it was quiet and honest and heartbreaking and right, all at once, which is the cruelest combination of things a moment can be. I spent the following months in a kind of grief I had no language for. I prayed and I worked and I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering whether I had destroyed something sacred for something that was never going to be mine anyway. I questioned myself constantly. I questioned my judgment, my faith, my sense of what honesty was even worth when the cost was this high. There were days I was genuinely not sure I was going to be okay. But slowly, not quickly, not neatly, but slowly, I started to understand something that I could not have understood any other way. I had told the truth in a moment when lying would have been so much easier, and I had survived what came after. The community did not cast me out. My parents, after time and many painful conversations, did not stop loving me. And I had not betrayed who I was. I had actually, for the first time in my adult life, been completely honest about who I was. That matters, even when it costs something, especially when it costs something. I do not know where Daniel is today. I hope he is well. I hope he is doing meaningful work and that he has found someone who can stand beside him without the weight of two completely different worlds pressing down on the middle of everything. I think about him sometimes with gratitude rather than grief now, which is something I did not believe would ever be possible in those early months. What I learned through all of it is this: telling the truth does not always protect you from pain. Sometimes it walks you directly into it, but it does protect you from something worse, and that something is a life built on silence and maybe and what if. Regret has a very particular weight to it, and it grows heavier with every year you carry it. I chose honesty, and it cost me in ways I am still working through. But it also showed me who I was on the inside when the stakes were real. And that is something no one can ever take from me. If you have ever told someone how you truly felt and watched the outcome go somewhere you never expected, I want you to know that I see you. That kind of courage is real, even when the story does not end the way you hoped it would. I would love to know your story. Drop it in the comments below. Have you ever confessed something deeply personal and faced consequences you were not prepared for? I read every single comment, and more often than not, your stories remind me that none of us are ever really carrying these things alone. And if this story spoke to something in your own heart, please share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Because sometimes the most important reminder we can give another person is that honesty, even painful honesty, is always worth it in the end.